The sun was setting behind the cracked hills, painting the alien sky in dark orange. The human walked slowly, his boots pressing into the dry soil that crumbled under every step. His ship had landed far away, smoke still rising from the damaged engines, but he needed water and shelter before he could even think of fixing it. The world looked dead at first, like no one had ever lived here. But his instincts told him something was watching. The silence felt heavy, almost too heavy, as if the air itself waited for something to happen. Then a faint sound reached him. It was soft, like small feet rushing across rocks. He turned his head quickly, his hand resting on the weapon at his belt. For a moment he saw nothing, only sharp stones and long shadows stretching across the ground. But then, from behind a broken pillar of stone, a pair of glowing little eyes stared at him. The human froze. The creature stepped out slowly. It was tiny, no taller than his knees, with thin arms, a round head, and skin that shimmered faintly in the fading light. The creature's eyes widened at the sight of him, and in that moment, the human knew. This was no single creature. More of them were hiding, breathing quietly, blending into the rocks. He raised his hands to show he meant no harm. The small figures whispered to each other in high-pitched voices, their language fast and sharp. One of them stepped forward, trembling, holding a spear that looked like it was made from bone and crystal shards. The human could see the weapon shaking in those tiny hands. Before he could say anything, a terrifying growl broke the silence. It came from behind the rocks. His body tensed. A pack of predators emerged, tall and lean, with black scales and long jaws filled with teeth. Their eyes burned with hunger, and the air filled with the stench of their breath. The tiny aliens screamed, scattering in every direction, their little legs too short to outrun such monsters. The humans saw the first predator leap toward them, claws extended, ready to crush one of the small creatures. Without thinking, his weapon was in his hand. The crack of gunfire echoed across the barren land. The beast twisted in midair and crashed onto the ground, lifeless. The others turned their eyes to him. 4 of them, moving fast, their claws scraping against the stone. The human shouted, not words, but raw sound, to draw their attention away from the tiny tribe. It worked. The predators charged at him instead. His heart raced, his hands steady. He fired again, dropping one, then another, but they were too fast. The third beast slammed into him, knocking him down. His gun slipped from his hand and skidded across the dirt. The creature's teeth snapped inches from his face. With all his strength, the human shoved his arm into its jaw, forcing it back, while his other hand reached desperately for a sharp rock. He smashed it against the beast's head once, twice, until the skull cracked. The body went limp, blood soaking into the soil. He pulled himself up, chest heaving, only to see the last predator stalking the tiny aliens. They were huddled together, crying out in their strange tongue. The human grabbed his weapon from the dirt and sprinted. He fired, but the shot grazed the beast. It turned, roaring, and leapt toward him. He braced himself, pulling the trigger again and again until the magazine was empty. The beast staggered, collapsed, and rolled across the stones. Dust rose in the fading light. Silence returned. The human lowered his weapon, breathing hard, sweat dripping down his forehead. Around him, the tiny creatures peeked from behind the rocks, their glowing eyes fixed on him. They stepped closer, slowly, carefully, as if approaching a god. The one with the shaking spear dropped it and fell to its knees. Then others followed, bowing low, their voices rising in strange chants that echoed in the empty desert. The human looked around, confused. He had not expected thanks. He had only acted on instinct. But the way they looked at him sent a chill down his spine. Their little faces showed awe, fear, and something else, devotion. The smallest of them, no bigger than a child's toy, walked forward holding a bundle of flowers. It placed them carefully at his feet, bowing so low its head touched the ground. He tried to speak, to tell them he was not their savior, but his voice caught in his throat. The tiny chief appeared, older than the others, with white strands woven into his hair. The chief raised his hand, and the tribe fell silent. He studied the human with deep, glowing eyes, then pointed at him and spoke slowly in broken words the human could almost understand. Protector, friend, chosen. The human's stomach tightened. He realized they believed something he did not intend. To them, he was not just a wanderer or a fighter. By saving them, he had become part of their world, bound to them in a way he could not yet see. The chanting began again, louder this time, echoing into the twilight. The human stood in the center, weapon heavy in his hand, his heart uneasy. The predators were gone, but he felt the true danger had only just begun. The human followed the small creatures as they guided him through the rocky landscape. Their glowing eyes flickered in the dark, like lanterns moving ahead of him. They moved quickly, darting between shadows, and he had to slow his long steps to avoid stepping on them. The ground opened into a narrow crack, almost invisible from outside. One of the tiny aliens pointed at it and motioned for him to follow. He frowned, because the opening was so small he doubted he could fit. But the creatures insisted, waving their hands, calling him with sharp, urgent voices. He dropped to his knees and slid into the crack, his shoulders scraping the stone. The tunnel was cramped, forcing him to crawl on his elbows while the tiny aliens ran ahead with ease. The air was damp and smelled of earth and smoke. The walls glowed faintly with strange moss, making the place shimmer green. The deeper he went, the louder the sounds became. Drums, high voices singing, and the crackling of fire. When the tunnel widened, the human froze in awe. An entire hidden village stretched beneath the ground. Dozens of tiny huts carved into the stone walls, small bridges made of vines, and fires burning in clay bowls lit the place. The tribe moved everywhere, children playing, elders sitting in groups, and hunters sharpening bone spears. They all stopped the moment they saw him. Silence spread like fire through the crowd. Every glowing eye turned toward the stranger who had walked into their heart. He felt uncomfortable. His head nearly touched the rocky ceiling, and every step he took shook the ground for them. He raised his hands to show peace. Slowly, the older chief stepped forward, leaning on a staff carved with symbols. The people whispered his name, their voices trembling with respect. The chief studied the human for a long moment, then nodded. He gestured, and a group of young ones brought a clay bowl filled with clear water. They held it up with tiny arms, and the human knelt so he could drink. The water was sweet and cold, sliding down his dry throat. The chief spoke in a mix of his own language and broken human words. You, protect. We, safe. You, with us. His words were slow, but the meaning was clear. The tribe began to murmur, then cheer, as if his arrival was something foretold. The human wanted to explain that he had only acted on instinct, that he was not their savior. But they did not give him the chance. He was led deeper into the cave village. The tunnels opened into a hall filled with paintings. Strange drawings covered the walls, giant beasts with sharp teeth, tiny figures holding hands, and in the center, a tall figure unlike the rest. The image looked eerily similar to him, a large being standing over the small ones, arms stretched wide in protection. The chief pointed at the painting, then at the human, and the tribe shouted in unison. The sound echoed so loudly that the human felt his chest shake. They brought him food, strange glowing fruit that tasted like honey mixed with spice. They gave him strips of dried meat from some unknown animal. The human ate slowly, trying to be polite, though his mind raced with questions. Why did these creatures trust him so quickly? Why did they see him as something more than he was? The chief stepped closer, his eyes burning with meaning. He touched the human's arm, then placed his other hand on his own chest. Bond, he said firmly. Protection, not free. You must join. The human frowned, not fully understanding. The chief called out, and the tribe gathered, forming a circle around them. Drums began to beat. Fires flared brighter. The crowd chanted, their voices fast and sharp, filling the cave with wild energy. The human's heart pounded. He looked around, trapped by the sea of glowing eyes. The chief raised both hands and declared something in his own tongue. The tribe answered with a cheer that shook the walls. The human looked from face to face, trying to guess what they wanted. Then the chief pointed at him again and spoke slowly in broken words. No alone. You fight, you stay. You save, you bond. The meaning struck him like a stone. They did not only want a protector, they wanted him tied to them, bound by more than courage. This was no simple thank you. It was a demand. The human tried to protest, but the chants grew louder, drowning his voice. The chief's eyes stayed locked on his, filled with iron certainty. One of the younger aliens, barely reaching his thigh, approached with careful steps. She carried a woven basket filled with flowers, shells, and tiny crystals. She placed it at his feet and bowed deeply. The human looked down, his breath caught in his chest. The crowd cheered again, stomping their small feet on the ground, the drums growing faster. He felt the weight of something he did not ask for pressing on his shoulders. He wanted to run, to climb back through the tunnel and leave, but he knew the truth. His ship was broken, and he needed them as much as they seemed to need him. The food, the water, the shelter, and now this strange ritual. They had taken him in, but it came with a price. His jaw tightened as the tribe's voices grew like thunder, and the chief raised his staff high, shouting one word that echoed through the stone: bond. The human stood in the middle, towering over them, his body tense, his mind filled with confusion. Around him, the tiny aliens danced and sang, their glowing eyes never leaving him. He realized the moment of choice had arrived, whether he wanted it or not. And deep inside, he understood that whatever the chief planned, it would change everything. The cave was alive with sound. Drums echoed from every corner, their rhythm fast and heavy, making the human's chest shake. Fires burned in clay bowls, their orange light dancing across the walls, painted with old symbols. The air smelled of smoke, flowers, and something sweet, almost dizzying. The tribe had gathered in a great circle, their glowing eyes fixed on him. He stood in the middle, towering above them, unsure what was about to happen. The chief raised his staff and spoke in his own tongue, his voice deep and strong. The people answered with cheers, stamping their small feet on the stone. The human tried to understand, catching only a few broken words mixed in. Savior, protector, bond. The same word again, bond. His unease grew heavier. The chief pointed at him, then spread his hands to the circle, as if presenting him to the tribe. From the shadows, a group of young women stepped forward. They were tiny, delicate, their hair braided with flowers, their clothes woven from shimmering threads. Each carried a small gift, fruit, shells, feathers, things that sparkled faintly in the firelight. They moved slowly, their heads bowed, but their eyes kept flicking up at the tall stranger standing before them. The tribe cheered louder, and the human's stomach turned. He finally understood. The chief's voice broke through the noise, speaking carefully, in words the human could not mistake. You save us, you family now. For family, we give you wife. The human froze. His heart slammed against his ribs. Wife? He looked around, waiting for someone to laugh, to explain that this was only a story, only a misunderstanding. But no one laughed. The crowd shouted with joy, their high voices bouncing off the stone walls. The women stood before him, silent and waiting. He took a step back, shaking his head. No, he muttered under his breath, though he knew they couldn't understand him. That's not what I meant. I didn't come here for this. But his voice was lost in the noise of the ceremony. The tribe was too caught up in their own belief. To them, this was not strange. It was natural. A protector had to be tied to the people, and the way to tie him was through marriage. One of the women stepped forward, braver than the rest. She lifted her head and looked at him directly. Her eyes glowed softly, not with fear, but with determination. She held out her hands, small and trembling, offering him a necklace made of tiny bones and crystal. The gesture was clear. Accept this, and the bond is sealed. The human's mouth went dry. His instincts told him to refuse, to walk away, but the circle of aliens around him felt like a wall. Their voices rose in unison, chanting words he could not understand, yet the meaning was heavy in the air. This was no choice. This was expectation. He glanced at the chief. The old alien was watching him closely, his expression calm but unyielding. His staff tapped the ground once, a sound that silenced the entire hall. Then the chief spoke in broken words again, slowly, as if to remove all doubt. You save us. You stay. You no go. You bond. One wife, yours. The silence that followed was crushing. Every eye waited for him to answer. The human swallowed hard, his pulse pounding in his ears. He wanted to scream that he was only a traveler, that he didn't belong here, that he couldn't marry someone half his size. But deep down, he knew that rejection would not just insult them, it might turn them against him. The brave woman still stood before him, her necklace stretched out in her little hands. Her face was calm, but her eyes revealed something more. Fear, hope, and trust all mixed together. She was as much a part of this as he was. Perhaps she, too, had no choice. The human's hand hovered in the air, torn between refusal and acceptance. The crowd waited, breaths held. If he took it, everything would change. If he refused, everything could break. He felt trapped, standing on the edge of something bigger than himself. Drums began again, soft at first, then louder, urging him toward the moment. The women behind the brave one lowered their eyes, waiting for his decision. The chief raised his staff high, ready to announce the outcome. The human's throat tightened, sweat running down his back. He had fought beasts, he had faced death, but nothing had made him feel so cornered. Finally, his fingers brushed the necklace. The crowd erupted in thunderous cheers, stomping their feet, raising their hands. The brave woman smiled faintly, though her eyes still shimmered with uncertainty. She stepped closer, so small she barely reached his waist, and gently placed the necklace around his neck. The chief shouted a word that shook the cavern. "Bond!" The people repeated it again and again, their voices filling the underground halls. Flowers were thrown into the air, fires blazed brighter, and the tribe danced in circles around him. The human stood still, stunned, the necklace heavy against his chest. He looked down at the little woman now standing by his side. She lowered her head respectfully, as if already tied to him by duty. His hands trembled, his mind whirled. He had come here looking for water and shelter. Instead, he had been given a wife. The chanting grew louder, the tribe celebrating their new union. But inside, the human's heart whispered one thought over and over again. What had he gotten himself into? The fires burned brighter as the chanting reached its peak. The human stood frozen in the middle of the circle, his chest tight, his hands clenched at his sides. He wanted to believe it was all some strange show of gratitude, but then he saw her step forward. She was smaller than most of the others, with long dark hair braided neatly, decorated with tiny glowing beads that shimmered under the firelight. Her eyes lifted slowly, meeting his, and for a second the noise of the crowd seemed to fade. She looked nervous, but there was also something brave in her gaze. The chief placed his staff down with a loud crack, and the echo silenced the entire hall. Every glowing eye turned toward the girl as she walked closer to the human. She carried no necklace, no flowers, no offering like the others had before. Instead, she came empty-handed, her small steps echoing softly against the stone floor. She stopped in front of him, so small that she barely reached his knee. Her hands trembled, but she raised them, touching his much larger palm with her tiny fingers. The crowd gasped and then cheered, as if this simple gesture had sealed something greater than words could. The human stared down, his heart racing. Her hand was so light in his, so fragile it felt like even breathing too hard could break her. He wanted to pull away, to tell them this was a mistake, but the girl's eyes held his, steady and searching. It was as though she was silently asking him not to reject her, not to shame her in front of her people. The chief's voice rang out, deep and commanding. He said something in his own tongue, then turned toward the human, speaking in broken words that cut through the firelight. She? Yours now. She bond. You protect. She serve. Family. The words slammed into him like a hammer. The crowd cheered again, stamping their feet, chanting that same word, bond, 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 until the walls trembled. The girl lowered her head, bowing deeply, and whispered something he could not understand. Her voice was soft, but it carried through the silence after the chanting stopped. She had spoken a vow. The human felt trapped. This was no accident anymore. It was official. The girl had been chosen for him, handed to him by her chief, accepted by her people. And the way they looked at him, so certain, so trusting, made it clear that no refusal would ever be understood. He glanced at the faces around him. Some were smiling with joy, others looked at him with suspicion, and a few with jealousy. But all of them believed the bond was real now. If he rejected her, he would not only insult the chief, but also break the honor of the girl standing before him. He clenched his jaw, breathing hard, unsure what choice he really had. The girl lifted her head again, and her small voice reached him. Yours, she said, struggling with the human words, but enough for him to understand. The sound hit him harder than the chief's declaration. He saw her tiny frame, the way she stood straight even though her hands shook, and he realized she had just given everything in front of everyone. The drums started again, this time softer, like a heartbeat. The crowd began to dance, circling around them, throwing flower petals made of glowing plants into the air. The petals drifted down, catching in the human's hair, landing on the girl's shoulders. She smiled faintly, though her eyes shimmered with fear. It was a celebration, but she knew as well as he did that the bond was more than just ritual. It was a tie that could not be undone. He leaned slightly closer, whispering under his breath, though he doubted she would understand. I didn't ask for this. But the girl only looked at him, her small hands still pressing against his palm, her face unreadable. The chief raised his staff once more, and the tribe bowed low to the ground. The girl did the same, kneeling before the human, placing her tiny hands on her chest as a sign of devotion. The human's throat tightened. He had fought beasts, walked through war zones, and faced death countless times, but nothing had left him this shaken. The ceremony ended with the tribe cheering louder than before. The drums stopped and the fires dimmed slightly. But the bond had been made, and the human could feel its weight pressing on him like a chain. The girl walked beside him now, her steps quick to match his long stride. The crowd followed, singing songs that told of saviors and warriors who had once been tied to their people. As they reached the smaller tunnels, the human glanced at her again. She kept her head lowered, but he noticed the way her eyes flicked toward him now and then, shy but curious. She was scared too, he realized. Not just of him, but of what her people expected from them both. When the crowd finally left them alone, the human sat against the stone wall, rubbing his face with his hands. He felt exhausted, his body aching from the fight earlier and his mind burning with confusion. The girl stood a few steps away, silent, as if waiting for him to speak first. After a long pause, she whispered in her own tongue, then tried again in broken human words. You? Not want? Her voice cracked with the question. The human looked at her, stunned. He realized she understood more than he thought. She knew this bond was strange for him. She knew he might reject it, but asking him outright in front of no one showed a kind of courage he hadn't expected. He sighed heavily, shaking his head. It's not about want, he muttered. It's about choice, and I didn't have one. She tilted her head, not catching every word, but enough to know his meaning. Her lips pressed together, her tiny shoulders rising as she straightened her back again. She placed her hand on her chest, then pointed at him. I stay. Always. The words, broken and simple, struck him harder than any blow. He stared at her, unable to respond, caught between anger, confusion, and something else he could not name. She had been given to him like a gift, like a duty, but her eyes showed more than duty. They showed a decision, a choice she had made, even if he had not. He leaned back against the stone, closing his eyes. The firelight flickered across the walls, and the sound of distant chants still echoed faintly. He knew one thing for certain. His life had changed forever. The human lay awake in the dark tunnel, his back against the rough stone. The fires outside had died down, and most of the tribe had gone to sleep. Only the soft drip of water and the faint breathing of the tiny aliens filled the silence. His new wife slept curled in a corner, her small body wrapped in woven cloth, her face peaceful under the dim glow of the moss. He tried to close his eyes, but unease pressed heavy on his chest. Something about the way some of the males had looked at him during the ceremony had left a warning in his mind. Not everyone wanted him here. He shifted his position, trying to rest, when a faint scratching noise caught his ears. It was soft, almost like rats moving through cracks, but it was steady and purposeful. His eyes opened wide. The sound came from above, from the smaller tunnels that ran like veins through the stone. He listened closely, his muscles tense. Then he caught another sound, a whisper. Not friendly, not welcoming. Angry voices, speaking too fast for him to understand. His hand went to his weapon, lying close at his side. He didn't move yet, waiting, watching the shadows flicker against the walls. The scratching grew louder, closer. His instincts screamed danger. Slowly, he reached out and touched the girl's shoulder. She woke with a start, her glowing eyes wide. He pressed a finger to his lips, telling her to stay quiet. She listened, her little body trembling, then whispered in broken words, "They test you, not want you." Her voice cracked with fear, but she knew what was happening. Before he could reply, a rock rolled down from the tunnel above. Then another. Shadows moved, quick and sharp. Suddenly, the attack began. A spear shot down from the cracks, striking the ground near his leg. Another clattered out off the stone wall, missing by inches. He rolled to the side, pulling the girl with him as more stones and crude weapons rained down. The whispers turned to shouts, angry cries of challenge and hatred. He pulled out his gun and aimed toward the shadows, firing a single shot. The sound exploded in the enclosed space, echoing so loudly that the tribe stirred awake in the tunnels beyond. The attackers hissed in fear, pulling back for a moment, but then returned with more fury. One dropped from the tunnel above, landing on his back, trying to drive a knife into his side. The human slammed the creature against the wall, twisting until the knife clattered away. Another rushed from the side, spear aimed low, but the human kicked it hard, sending the small body flying across the ground. The girl screamed, clutching his arm. More shadows moved in the cracks, their glowing eyes full of rage. They were smaller than him, weaker than him, but their speed and numbers made them dangerous. His heart pounded as he fought to keep them away from the girl. He grabbed a fallen spear and swung it like a club, the wooden shaft cracking against stone and bone alike. The attackers hissed, circling, testing his strength. Then silence fell for a moment. The human stood, breathing hard, his weapon ready. The girl clung to his side, whispering in terror. They hate, they jealous. You take wife. They want her. Her words made his blood run cold. This wasn't just about him being an outsider. It was about the bond forced upon them. Some of the males believed she should have been theirs, not given to a stranger. One of the attackers stepped into the dim light. He was older, taller than the others, with sharp scars across his face. His eyes glowed with fury. He raised his spear, pointing it directly at the human, and spoke in a low growl. The human couldn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. Leave or die. The human's grip tightened on the weapon in his hand. He looked down at the tiny girl clutching him, then back at the scarred attacker. I'm not leaving, he said firmly, though they couldn't understand his language. But his tone, his stance, the way he shielded the girl behind him, all of it told them he was not afraid. The scarred one snarled and rushed forward. The human swung the spear, blocking the strike, then shoved the smaller body back with sheer strength. Two more came from the sides, but he moved quickly, grabbing one by the arm and hurling him into the other. The tunnel shook with the force of the struggle. Dust rained from the ceiling, and the girl cried out as the fight closed in around them. Finally, the human fired his weapon again, the blast deafening in the enclosed space. The shot struck the wall inches from the scarred attacker's head, leaving a smoking hole in the stone. The tribe froze. Silence fell instantly. Even the ones hidden in the cracks stopped moving. The human stood tall, breathing heavily, weapon aimed steady. His eyes burned with warning. He had spared them, but just barely. The attackers hissed low, backing away into the shadows. Their glowing eyes vanished one by one into the cracks. The scarred leader gave him one last look of pure hatred before disappearing into the dark. The tunnel was quiet again, but the tension lingered like a blade against the throat. The human lowered his weapon slowly. The girl still clung to him, her tiny body trembling, tears glistening in her glowing eyes. He crouched down to her level, brushing the dust from her hair. "It's over," he whispered, though even he wasn't sure if it was true. The sound of footsteps approached. Torches flared as other members of the tribe arrived, led by the chief himself. He looked around at the scattered weapons, the broken stones, and the fear still heavy in the air. His gaze met the humans, and for a moment, no words were spoken. The chief understood what had happened, and the humans saw the weight in his eyes. The chief raised his staff and barked orders, sending his people to chase down the attackers. Then he turned back, his face grim. He spoke slowly, the broken words carrying across the silence. "You, not welcome by all. You must prove. Tomorrow, trial." The human's jaw tightened. His arms ached. His body throbbed from the fight, and the girl still trembled beside him. But he understood the message. Saving them once was not enough. If he wanted to stay, if he wanted to protect the girl now bound to him, he would have to face something far worse than angry whispers in the dark. A trial awaited him, and failure would mean losing everything. The next day came heavy with silence. The human stood at the edge of the cavern while the tribe gathered around him. The chief's words from the night before still echoed in his head. He must prove himself. The girl, his new wife, stood close to him, her tiny hand clutching the edge of his clothes. Her glowing eyes were wide with worry, but she said nothing. Around them, the tribe whispered, their voices sharp and doubtful. Some wanted him gone, some feared him, but all of them demanded proof. The chief stepped forward, his staff striking the ground 3 times. The sound silenced the crowd. He spoke in his own tongue, his voice deep and steady. The human could not understand every word, but the gestures were clear enough. He pointed toward the dark tunnel that stretched into the heart of the mountain. The crowd hissed and murmured as soon as the tunnel was named. Fear spread through them like smoke. Even without knowing their words, the human understood. Whatever lived in that tunnel was no ordinary beast. The girl tugged at his arm, whispering in broken words. "Beast, big, kill many." Her voice shook, and her tiny body pressed closer to him. "You fight, or you die." The human's jaw tightened. He had faced death before, but never under so many watchful eyes, never with a whole tribe waiting to see if he would succeed or fail. The chief raised his staff and declared loudly, "Trial!" The tribe shouted back in unison, the sound echoing off the stone. There was no turning back. They led him through winding passages until the air grew damp and heavy. The walls were covered in scratches deep as knife cuts, and the smell of decay hung thick in the air. The girl followed close, but the chief stopped her at the entrance of the cavern. He shook his head, pointing for her to stay behind. She tried to argue, her small voice desperate, but the chief's command was final. She looked at the human, tears gathering in her glowing eyes. "Come back," she whispered, her voice trembling. The human nodded once, then stepped into the darkness. The cavern opened wide, swallowing him in shadows. The glow from the moss was faint, just enough to reveal broken bones scattered across the ground, skulls, ribs, twisted remains of creatures the beast had killed before. His hand gripped his weapon tightly, his breath steady but heavy. Each step echoed, carrying into the endless dark. Then he heard it. A hiss, low and deep, vibrating through the air. His chest tightened as the sound grew louder. From the far side of the cavern, something massive shifted. Eyes opened, two enormous orbs glowing like fire. The serpent rose from the darkness, its body covered in thick armored scales that shimmered faintly. Its size was overwhelming, its body coiling around pillars of stone as it slithered closer. The human lifted his weapon and fired. The shot cracked through the cavern, striking the beast's scales, but the bullet bounced off harmlessly. The serpent reared its head back and struck, its jaws snapping with enough force to shatter rock. He rolled to the side, the wind of its strike brushing past him, and fired again, aiming for its mouth. The bullet hit inside, making the creature roar, but it wasn't enough. The serpent lunged again, faster this time. Its tail whipped across the cavern, slamming into him with bone-crushing force. He flew backward, crashing into the wall. Pain exploded through his body, but he forced himself up, coughing blood. His weapon shook in his hands. The serpent coiled, ready to strike again, its eyes locked on him with endless hunger. He scanned the cavern quickly. His bullets could not break its scales. He needed something else. His eyes fell on the broken stalactites hanging from the ceiling, sharp and heavy. An idea sparked. He steadied his breath, waiting for the serpent's next attack. The beast lunged, its jaws wide. He dove forward, rolling beneath its massive body, the ground trembling as it struck behind him. He grabbed a spear from the bones scattered across the floor and rammed it into the serpent's softer underbelly. The spear snapped, barely piercing, but the beast hissed in pain, twisting violently. The human stumbled to his feet and fired again, aiming at its eyes. One bullet struck true, bursting into the glowing orb. The serpent screamed, its body thrashing wildly, slamming against the cavern walls. Rocks fell from above, dust filling the air. He knew he had one chance. He sprinted toward the far wall, climbing onto a jagged rock as the serpent turned toward him, its remaining eye burning with fury. It struck again, its jaws wide enough to swallow him whole. At the last second, he leapt aside. The serpent's head slammed into the wall, cracking the stone. A huge stalactite broke loose from the ceiling and came crashing down, piercing straight through the beast's skull. The serpent convulsed, its massive body twisting, then went still. The cavern shook with its final breath before silence returned. The human collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving, blood dripping from his wounds. His weapon hung limp in his hand, empty. He had done it? Barely. For a long moment, he sat in the dark, the silence broken only by his own breathing. Then he heard voices, shouts from the tunnel. Torches flared as the tribe entered cautiously. Their eyes widened at the sight of the fallen serpent, its massive body sprawled across the cavern. The chief stepped forward, staring at the human with something close to awe. The girl ran past them all, straight to him. She threw her tiny arms around his leg, crying into his torn clothes. "You live," she whispered over and over, her small body trembling with relief. The chief raised his staff high and shouted words that echoed like thunder. The tribe answered with cheers, their voices filling the cavern. "Protector! Family! Bond!" They chanted again and again, their fear of the serpent replaced by triumph. The human stood slowly, leaning on his weapon, his body screaming with pain. The girl clung to him, refusing to let go. He looked around at the cheering tribe, their glowing eyes filled with trust and pride. He realized in that moment that he was no longer just a stranger to them. He had faced their greatest terror and lived. He had proven himself. But deep inside, as the cheers shook the air, he felt the heavy weight of the truth. He had won their acceptance, but it had cost him more than he expected. He was bound now, not just to the tribe, but to the tiny girl who looked at him as if he were her whole world. And there was no way back to the life he had before. The serpent's blood still stained the stones when the human walked back into the main cavern. His steps were heavy, his clothes torn, and every muscle in his body ached, but he stood tall. The tribe gathered around him, their glowing eyes wide with awe. Whispers turned into shouts, shouts into chants, until the entire place shook with their voices. The chief raised his staff high, his voice booming above them all, declaring the trial complete. The human had done what none of them could. He had killed the beast that had haunted their tribe for years. The girl ran to him, her small legs moving as fast as they could. She pressed her tiny hands against his bloody side, tears glowing in her eyes. "Hurt," she whispered, voice trembling. "I fix." She pulled at the cloth around her own shoulders, tearing strips to press against his wounds. Her hands shook, but her touch was gentle. The human let out a long breath, lowering himself so she could reach. For a moment, in her frightened care, he forgot the chanting and the eyes of the tribe. When he lifted his head again, the entire circle of aliens was kneeling. Even the jealous ones, even those who had attacked him in the night, bowed low to the ground. The chief spoke, slower this time, trying to form words the human could understand. "You, hero. You, family. You, no stranger. You, ours now." The human's throat tightened. He had never asked to be part of this. He had only acted to survive, to protect the girl when danger came. But now, in their eyes, he was more than a protector. He was one of them. The celebration began. Fires burned high, drums pounded with joy instead of fear, and the tribe danced in circles, singing songs of victory. They painted the walls with new images of a tall figure standing over the fallen serpent, the small people at his side. They brought him food, gifts, and garlands of glowing flowers. Children laughed, climbing around his legs as if he were a living mountain. The human sat silently, watching, overwhelmed. But even in the middle of joy, he felt the weight pressing down. He had no ship, no way home, and now no freedom. The necklace around his neck, the girl at his side, the tribe's chanting, all of it tied him to this place. He was theirs, whether he wanted it or not. The girl stayed close, never letting go of his arm. She looked up at him with wide eyes, her voice soft. "You strong. You save us. I, yours now, always." Her words were simple, broken, but the meaning was clear. She was not just assigned to him. She had chosen to believe in him. Later, when the fires burned low and the tribe settled into quiet celebration, the human sat apart on a stone ledge. The girl climbed up beside him, sitting with her small knees pulled to her chest. She leaned against him without fear, her head barely reaching his arm. For a long time they stayed like that, silent. Then she spoke, her voice trembling as though she feared the answer. "You? Stay? Not go?" The human closed his eyes. His mind drifted to his broken ship lying silent in the wasteland. Even if he repaired it, even if he left this world, could he walk away now? He had seen the fear in their eyes, the way they had trembled before the serpent, the way they had clung to hope when he stood against it. And now he had seen the joy in their faces, the trust in the girl's eyes. Walking away would mean breaking them. He opened his eyes and looked down at her. Her tiny face was turned up toward him, waiting, pleading. He placed his large hand gently on her head. "I stay," he said quietly, even though the words were heavy. She smiled, her eyes glowing brighter than the moss around them. The next morning, the chief called the tribe together again. He stood before them all, his staff glowing in the firelight, and made an announcement. His voice echoed strong and proud. He fight for us. He win for us. He one of us. Protector, husband, family. The tribe cheered, louder than before, shaking the very walls of the cavern. The human stood there, his wounds still aching, but the cheers washing over him. The girl held his hand tightly, her small fingers barely wrapping around one of his. He looked at her and saw no fear now, only pride. As the celebration roared around him, the human realized he had crossed a line he could never return from. He was not just a visitor anymore. He was tied to these people by blood, by battle, by bond. The necklace on his chest glowed faintly in the firelight, a mark of his new life. And though doubt still whispered in his heart, though he still longed for the stars, he knew the truth. These tiny aliens had given him more than food, shelter, or safety. They had given him belonging. They had given him family. And now, as the girl leaned against him, her voice soft with trust, he understood what that meant. "I stay," he whispered again, this time not just to her, but to himself. The tribe's songs rose high into the tunnels, echoing for miles, announcing to the world that they were no longer afraid. They had a protector now. They had a bond, and no one, human or beast, would take that from them again.